I'm going to show you how to memorize a speech. This is part 4 of a 4-part series on the different approaches to public speaking preparation and delivery. Take a look at the links in the description below to see all the other parts. I have to start with a caveat. Memorizing speeches in a word-for-word way is not something most speech teachers or coaches recommend. I don't recommend it either as your first or second option. In fact, I only recommend memorizing everything in a speech if that's your only choice, the only appropriate way to do a specific speech. In most business, professional, academic settings, you'll very rarely be expected to memorize an entire speech word for word. For most longer presentations, even professional speakers, full-time speakers, at minimum, have a set of notes handy somewhere that they can at least glance at as a safety net. On the other hand, here are some situations where memorizing might be necessary or even beneficial. I've seen many people recite a poem as part of a performance. It's obviously really important to get every single word right if you're doing a spoken word performance like that. If you're doing any kind of performance on a stage, whether it's a monologue in a play or even a long scene, you'll be memorizing dialogue. And you could say that a monologue within a theatrical performance is a type of public speaking. Many stand-up comedians memorize every single joke in their entire routine. I went to see Brian Regan, one of my favorite stand-up comics, and after his set, he came back out to interact with the audience, and people were shouting out old classic jokes that made him famous. And then he'd perform some of those old jokes exactly how I saw him do it on video years before. Same wording, same timing, same emphasis, attitude. It was an exact memorized duplicate of the way he told the joke on the original comedy special. Clearly, giving a speech from memory involves a lot more than words. It means using every tool in the toolbox to bring your message to life, like gestures, emphasis, attitude. In fact, one common use of speech memorization is to memorize other people's speeches so you can learn the skills that you admire. For example, online, many people have attempted to duplicate everything about some classic speeches, like the locker room speech from the hockey movie called Miracle. Amazing. I did a breakdown of that speech a couple years ago. The speech is only about 124 words, really short. People can practice memorizing that. There's a funny episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm where Larry David memorizes Lincoln's entire Gettysburg Address. It's a funny episode, but that's another short speech. It fits on less than a page. When I was in high school, a bunch of my friends and I memorized Bill Murray's short speech about the Dalai Lama from the movie Caddyshack. Memorizing short speeches is like a fun way to learn what a great speech sounds like, what a funny speech sounds like, and then you can take those skills and integrate them and make them your own over time. So I don't recommend memorizing for most speeches, but if you gotta memorize a message, here are some overlapping tips to help you. And even if you never plan to do an entire speech memorized, these tips will help you with every other type of speaking that we've been talking about in this series because a lot of our memory is involved in all these other types of speaking one way or the other. First, keep your message short. Everybody appreciates a concise message, and the shorter the message, the easier it will be to memorize. If you try to memorize anything more than about a minute or let's say 90 seconds, it's going to be extremely difficult. If you're doing a toast at a wedding and you want to memorize it, keep it short. If you need to introduce somebody like a guest speaker and you want to get it exactly right without looking at any notes, keep it concise. You won't always have a choice as to how long your message is, but when you do have a choice, keep it short. Second, use a clear structure. If each part of your message flows logically from one point to the next, that'll make it much easier for you to remember. For example, persuasive messages are typically structured around 3 main points: problem, solution, and benefits. If you have a clear and logical structure like that, then your brain will have a much easier time remembering those points because each idea flows in a rational way that moves your message forward. If you can remember each of your main points, it'll make it that much easier to remember the contents within each of those points. Third, use mnemonic devices. You could create an acronym or anything that helps cue you as to what comes next. For example, maybe the main points of your message spell out a word or make a funny sentence that helps you remember, and that cues you as to what comes next. That's how we teach students to remember the musical notes on the staff. The mnemonic devices, every good boy deserves fudge for the lines, and the spaces spell out the word face, F-A-C-E, as in the boy gets fudge all over his face. You can use mnemonic devices to remember your main points or the details inside your main points. Fourth, you can use a visual map that you then picture in your head. You could use an existing diagram that shows the key steps of your message, or a diagram you create on the page and then visualize that to remember your unique message. You could also visualize by using what some people call a memory palace. This is really its own technique because it's pretty complex, but it's like another version of visualizing a map in your head. A memory palace is where you enter a house, and in your mind, each room, each piece of furniture, each photograph, lamp represents a specific point or subpoint within your message in that room. I actually used this memory palace technique when I did a presentation in graduate school many years ago. I presented on the 5 canons of rhetoric from Cicero's book. I used no notes during the speech. Instead, I mentally walked through my childhood home. Each room represented a different main point. Each piece of furniture or item in the room represented a subpoint or different idea within each of the 5 canons. And I walked through my entire house in my mind as I gave the speech. And by association and practice, each item in the room helped me remember what came next in my speech. Using a memory palace is usually reserved for complex and long messages. So for a short memorized speech, you may want to just simply visualize a diagram and picture that in your head. 5th, break your speech into smaller chunks and then memorize each chunk. Now, we've already talked about this in a way because if you're structuring your speech around clear main points, then you could do this pretty easily. A great way to practice memorizing your speech is by memorizing one main point at a time. But you can also break each main point down into smaller chunks and then memorize each individual piece. For example, within a main point, you might be memorizing a specific quotation from somebody and a story you tell next, and then a statistic. The idea is you practice each of those chunks individually as many times as you need to memorize them word for word, rather than trying to memorize the entire main point in one single chunk. The quotation, story, and statistic each have their own substance, narrative, and unique characteristics that'll help you remember each one individually. 6, tell stories because they are the easiest type of content to remember compared to technical information, statistics, and data. The best way to craft and remember a story is to use the classic storytelling framework as you practice. Every story, for example, should have a beginning, middle, and ending. And when you tell stories in a chronological order like this, each part of the story will flow naturally from one part to the next. Stories are also really helpful because you can usually picture them in your head as you tell them, and that makes them 10 times easier to remember because you can see the action as you describe it. That's how it was so easy for me to memorize Bill Murray's speech from the movie Caddyshack. He's telling a story with points along the way in the journey. I wouldn't call any of these memory techniques easy, but the one my students and corporate clients find most easy to practice is the story. If they work on a story even a few times through out loud, they can usually remember it pretty close to word for word just after a few repetitions without looking at any notes. And 7th, practice your speech aloud. These repetitions will help you remember your message because your practice will make the speech part of your DNA compared to just reading them silently on a page. Practicing aloud is really the only way to work on your delivery skills like gestures, eye contact, emphasis, and attitude. These are all elements of how to animate what you say so it doesn't come across as mechanical. And those gestures and other nonverbal expressions will bring your words to mind a little easier in what you might call muscle memory. It works the same way that remembering song lyrics works. It's much easier to remember lyrics when you're actually singing them. And in the same way, your words will come to mind more easily when you are acting out your speech non-verbally the same way each time. And the ultimate goal of practicing aloud is that your speech no longer even sounds memorized. Ideally, even if 100% of the words are memorized, your message should sound like an authentic, genuine message that's delivered in the moment so it sounds fresh every time. Here's a summary of the 7 tips for memorizing a speech. Even if you don't have an entire speech coming up that you need to memorize word for word, you can use these techniques to help you remember any key parts of any message, like an important quotation, a story, or simply a way to remember your main points more easily. And because this is part 4 of the series on speech delivery, if you've made it this far, then mention that in the comments below, and I'll give you a congratulations and a heart for making it to the end. Until next time, thanks, God bless, and I will see you soon.